Diversity, equity, and inclusion are priorities across the entire government, and that includes the U.S. Army and Navy. Both services have offices devoted to the promotion and implementation of those goals. Anselm Beach is Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army for Diversity and Inclusion, and Charles Barber is Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Programs for the Navy. Charles, I want to start with you. Give us a quick explanation or definition of those three terms: diversity, equity, inclusion.
Sure, and I'll keep them very concise. I think diversity, just recognizing and celebrating the presence of difference. Equity, when you think about equity, I think you need to think about the difference between equity and equality. Equity being how do we assess those policies and processes to ensure that we achieve those equality of outcomes that we want to achieve. And inclusion, creating that environment, that culture where everybody can show up and be their true authentic selves and reach their full potential. But I would also add, when you have conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion, meritocracy is also a piece that should be included also. Because with Secretary Del Toro, the Commandant, the CNO, one of our key themes is to ensure that diversity and meritocracy are harmonic principles that don't compromise one for the other. And with the way that we continuously assess barriers and equity, we're doing just that.
All right, and Anselm, let me ask you about Secretary Lloyd Austin. He's the first African-American Secretary of Defense. What has that meant to your work?
So I think it's been a historic time in the Department of Defense, right? So we've started with Secretary Austin. We've also had Secretary Wormuth, who is the first woman who is the Secretary of the Army. And I think what this really actually brings to bear is that, as Chuck talked about meritocracy, about the value of merit, performance, and I think what it shows is that people, once provided opportunities, could really excel across all government. And I think we're in an incredibly important time when we think about how we compete for talent. The Department of Defense is competing for talent with everyone else. And it's also critical to our national security to be able to pull from all facets of America to optimize the talent for the defense of the nation.
You know, Chuck, it's said a lot that diversity is our strength, that it's critical to mission success. But how does it make the U.S. military stronger and more effective?
Well, studies show, Mimi, that diverse organizations perform higher. When you think about how you can link DE&I efforts to culture, how do you improve adaptability? How do you improve consistency? How do you improve institutional learning? And if you leverage diversity properly, you can transition organizations to be much more higher performing organizations and also becoming learning organizations, and so not just looking at root cause learning, root cause analysis, but how do you get towards root cause learning? And at those diverse perspectives, they help you to get to just that.
Yes, go ahead.
I could add to that. And I could make this very granular. For the United States Army, we're in the business of protecting the nation. We're in the warfighting business. And I think as you think about warfighting, this goes directly to the ability to perform multi-domain operations, which is the future of warfare. And what it means is that the battlefield is now a lot more complex, and we need new ways of thinking. How do we engage new ways of fighting across that battlefield? And for that, we need new ways of thinking. And we need new perspectives. This also cuts across the language spectrum. When we engage with foreign enemies, how do we understand the culture, how the psyche of those warriors? That is part of what diversity gives us.
Yeah. So really, diversity becomes an operational imperative.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
So, Chuck, what would you say are the biggest barriers to implementing diversity, equity, inclusivity? Is this a cultural issue?
Absolutely. And I will tell you, Department of the Navy, Marine Corps, and Operational Navy are really trying to look at this space, not just from a compliance perspective like we have in the past, but from a culture perspective. And I know we'll get to the point we get a chance to talk about some of our key initiatives, but really, this is a cultural issue. How are we really looking at this from a cultural perspective so we don't continue to have the same conversations 15 or 20 years from now? So absolutely, it is a culture issue.
Well, Anselm, it's very easy to have a policy, but how do you change culture, especially in an organization like the military?
Absolutely. And I think part of, to answer part of what you asked earlier, I think we are currently engaged as a nation in a passionate conversation around diversity, equity, inclusion. And I think part of the passionate conversation and why it becomes hard to operationalize is because of the ways that we've thought about this. And we've thought about it in a very one-dimensional way for a long time. So as we think about diversity, equity, inclusion for the Army, it's about a framework that we build cohesive teams in inclusive environments to fight and win the nation's wars. So it cuts across just representation, but it moves how we get people from across the entire spectrum of the United States, not only to be reflected in our Army, but to move to full participation. Secretary Wormuth, in her new objectives, really talks about, people. And for the Army, we think about, the three main priorities, which are people, modernization, and readiness. Diversity, equity, inclusion really is a bridge that connects all those three.
Chuck, he just mentioned cohesion. So does diversity impact cohesion? Have you seen a negative impact on unit cohesion?
It absolutely affects cohesion. And I think with how we've launched listening sessions across the Department of the Navy, as we've kind of used that input from sailors and Marines across the department, we have learned that it does absolutely impact cohesion, absolutely.
In a good way or a bad way?
I think both. I mean, I think in some cases where you have constructive conversations about these topics, I think you start to build cultural intelligence where it does improve cohesion. But in some of those instances where those conversations may not be quite as constructive, we start to build cultural arrogance. And so in those instances, it doesn't help with cohesion. So I think it's a little bit of both.
Anselm, you were just about to tell me about a program called Project Inclusion and listening tours. Tell me about that.
So Project Inclusion is an umbrella term that we use for the strategic initiatives that we have in the Army. It started with the Army People Strategy, which is a strategy that overlies all things people for the Army. And included in that is the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Annex to the Army People Strategy, which is a 5-year strategy to drive to diversity in states. So that kind of connection and integration. And as a part of Project Inclusion, we started Your Voice Matters listening sessions. And Your Voice Matters listening session really is the way that we engage soldiers and civilians across our Army to understand their lived experiences, their stories, and to understand the barriers so we could shape policy and initiatives better so that they could be operated, operated at the local level, right? So here's the thing. We have now gone to 27 installations across the Army, across the world, and we have conducted almost 200 sessions, engaged almost 10,000 soldiers and civilians. That really demonstrates, the Army's intent to really hear from the force, and it really ties into Secretary Wormuth's initiatives, which she outlines for positive command climate, and also how we get to harmful behaviors.
And so what did you hear? What was the biggest thing that you heard? I mean, that's a lot of listening, 10,000 people.
It is a lot of listening. So one of the things that we heard is that leadership is very important in driving these initiatives. So how does how leaders at the local levels model behaviors? How do they ensure that they're driving integration and inclusion so that we could optimize talents? Those are some of the big things that we get from the listening session. We also have analyzed across 20 themes, so starting from leadership all the way to how people get promoted. So it's a fascinating study and a barometer of what's happening in real time.
So Chuck, I want to ask you about measuring success, because it's one thing to have initiatives, but how do you know it's working?
Absolutely. Fortunately, we've had great support from Secretary Del Toro, CNO Gilday, and Commandant General Berger. And what that has allowed us to do is to really develop a very rigorous and analytical tool that we call our underrepresentation framework. And so basically what we've done is we've taken every military and civilian occupational specialty, and we've developed a civilian analog with data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Department of Labor. So what this does for us, those 100+ initiatives, it allows us to really see how we're using data to inform policy changes to really improve underrepresentation.
You know, I wanted to ask you about diversity in the officer corps, right? So officers versus enlisted, and then also on the civilian side, with the senior service, the SES, as opposed to the GS scale. Are you looking at that?
Absolutely. And I would also add that the entire DEI framework is a total force framework. So it's not just focused on just the military side of the house. It also includes the civilian side of the house. And just based off our initial barrier analysis, it is very apparent that you have diversity at the lower grades, the lower ranks within the military, and as you go up the ranks, you know, diversity
it starts to disappear.
Absolutely. And so with how we're using that underrepresentation framework and also our maturity model, this is a way for us to continuously assess barriers and equity to really see how we can move the needle. This is not the Department of the Navy putting quotas in place, not at all. This is a means for us to provide a common operating picture of data so that leaders, civilian and military, can make informed decisions, employment decisions moving forward while linking all of these things to culture.
You know, Anselm, you had said one time that, that you want to move the conversation beyond representation. Explain that.
So I think as we look at diversity, equity, and inclusion, a lot of times it starts at representation because that seems to be the first thing, and it's an important part of it. However, if we only stay at representation and we don't get to full participation, representation without participation is still exclusion. And what we want to drive is inclusion. So what does that mean? It means that, you know, we have to ensure that there's a policy framework in place, that there's an understanding of the value that diversity brings. Because in a lot of instances, part of the narrative is that, you know, we have diversity and we want to institute quotas, or we just want to put people in place just for representation's sake. And without a defined purpose, then that becomes counterproductive. And so we need to ensure that leaders understand the value, that there's a framework in place where people could have choice as they optimize their talent and they be in service to the nation.
Mimi, this is why I thought it was important when you asked about diversity, equity, and inclusion, that you have to include meritocracy in the conversation. And when you look at the underrepresentation framework that we're presenting, it allows us to present underrepresentation as an equity issue, not quotas. Again, so I just thought that was very important to kind of bring those points up.
All right. Well, gentlemen, we've got to leave it at that. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.